Hello and welcome to the Abbotsford Dialogues. I'm Janhavi Prasada and I bring to you the life, the people, and their triumphs and journeys from the Himalayan terrain. Today with me is James Champion, who is a conservationist, a photographer, and an author from the United Kingdom. He has compiled two books, Under the Tail of the Diplodocus and my favorite, The Tripwire for a Tiger. Both are compilations of his grandfather, F.W. Champion, who served in this Himalayan terrain as a forest officer and had expert knowledge about the region. James has inherited his DNA and is following the footsteps of his grandfather. And he is with us in Uttarakhand at Abbotsford. So, quickly, let's get into a conversation with James. Welcome to the Abbotsford Dialogues, James. It's wonderful to have you at Abbotsford Estate, my heritage homestay. Indeed, we are in a setting which is full of a lot of flora and fauna, bird life, and of course the wild cat, which is, I think, of interest to you. So I will begin with asking you, where did all this interest in wildlife, photography, writing, and conservation, what was the spark that really uh, got you going into this journey?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to be back here because I was here in 2012 or 2013, I think, for the launch of my book, Tripwire for a Tiger, which took place at the Kumaon Literary Festival. So it was lovely to be here then, and it's lovely to be here now. I think the thing that really got me interested in natural history was perhaps because so many generations of my family have been interested in natural history, so it must have been in my genes. But I think the thing that really sparked my interest was collecting tea cards. In the UK, there used to be a tea company called Brook Bond, which
Yes,
I
we
think
still
maybe
have it.
still
We
exists.
still have
yeah.
it. It's under the name of Lipton now.
That's
Lipton
right,
Brook
yeah.
Bond.
So Brook Bond used to sell tea in small packets, and in each packet was a card. And there were a series of 50 cards, and they were about particular topics at particular times. And one of those series was British butterflies, another was wildlife in danger, another was wild animals of Asia.
Wow.
And so you could collect all 50 cards, and if the series was discontinued before you'd achieved the collection of all the 50, you could then write to Brook Bond and they would supply you with the cards which you hadn't got. And they would also supply you with a lovely album, and you could stick the cards into the specific places within the album, and then there was information underneath about each of those animals or each of those plants that featured on the particular card.
Right.
And though they were highly educational, and I became absolutely fascinated.
Were they all native to Britain, or were they all
Well, they were actually
international?
not all about nature. Some of them were about famous historical figures. There was one called Transport Through the Ages. There was one about costumes. There was one about kings and queens of England.
Interesting.
So it wasn't just about natural history, but the ones that were about natural history were the ones that really captured my imagination. And I had an aunt who lived in Montreal in Canada, and Brook Bond Canada also did series which were not the same as the ones that were sold in the UK or were provided in the UK, and she used to collect them for me as well. So still to this day, I have all my albums, both of Brook Bond UK tea cards and Brook Bond Canada tea cards.
Right.
So they really got me interested.
So tell me, in the morning when we were on our way to Pungot, your
Yeah.
sister Julia,
Yes.
she showed me this beautiful picture of your home in Scotland.
Yes.
Cairnwood.
Cairnsmore.
Cairnsmore.
Yes.
Stunning setting with a lake
Yes.
in front.
Yeah.
And surrounded by beautiful trees that your great
That
grandfather
my
must have
grandfather. Yeah.
planted, and
Yeah.
the rhododendrons from
Yes,
India
from
apparently.
here. Yes, absolutely.
Tell me how what were your growing days like really? What
Well,
was
it's
it
actually
like?
that's a very interesting thing because although that house had been in my grandmother's family since 1780, the family hadn't lived in that house for about 100 years in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And so the house was rented out as a holiday cottage to the Dukes of Bedford, who were one of the big aristocratic families in the UK. And they used that house as their shooting lodge and holiday cottage. But when my grandfather, F.W. Champion, the one who was working here as a forest officer, and his wife retired, the house had already become empty because the Dukes of Bedford had decided to terminate the lease. So the house was empty and it really was falling into disrepair. My father had inherited it because it skipped a generation because it wasn't supposed to go down the female line.
I see.
So my
Very
grandmother...
typical of the
Very
India used to be.
Typical, exactly. So anyway, my father inherited it when he was in his 20s, serving in the Navy, and his salary was very low, and the tax to be paid on that house was enormous.
Right.
And so my grandfather and my grandmother said to my father, if you let us stay in this house for the rest of our lives rent-free, we will look after it for you, and we'll cover the day-to-day expenses. So that's how the house stayed in the family. And then my grandfather, F.W. Champion, died in 1970, but my grandmother, Judy Champion, she continued to live in the house alone until 1983. Then she died, and the house was empty again. But when my father retired from his job in London in 1988, he and my mother moved back into that old family
And how old were you then?
I must have been in my 20s.
Right.
And so I was busy working abroad. In fact, I was working in Japan at that time. But my parents settled in and loved living there. And now my sister Julia and her husband have taken it on, and they're busy renovating it and doing all sorts of upgrading and so on, just as you are here at Abbotsford.
Yes.
And they have 2 children, so hopefully the house will remain in the family for years.
So what was happening in Japan?
I was an English teacher in Japan.
Oh my God.
My career actually has
tell
been...
me about your career.
Yes, quite interesting. My passion is wildlife, but I didn't go into a wildlife-related job because I was not very good at mathematics, and to study biology, which you really need to do if you want to move into wildlife protection or whatever, was very difficult because I wasn't good at mathematics. But luckily, I was a gifted linguist, and so I trained to be a teacher of English as a foreign language, really just as a way of having an opportunity to travel the world.
Yeah.
So when I graduated from university, I took the Trans-Siberian Railway through the Soviet Union as it then was at the end of 1986 and travelled all the way to Japan. The journey took 10 days from London to Japan. And then I found a job as an English teacher in Japan and worked there for 2 years initially and then for another 2 years after that. And so ever since then, I've been working really mostly as a language teacher and doing my hobby or following my hobby of natural history in my free time.
So I think that's where the flair for writing also comes in.
Probably, yes, that's right. Yes, I think that must be true. I am very interested in literature and reading and so on. But actually the books which I've published, they're not really written by me, they're compiled by me.
Right.
So the Tripwire book and the one which has just appeared today, The Tiger's Champion, are actually collections of articles and photographs written, in the case of the articles, by my grandfather.
Right.
And these are articles which appeared in different magazines and journals around the world, but had never been published before in a single volume. So I started collecting these articles back in the 1980s, and I thought it would be lovely to put them into a single volume, but there are too many to put in one volume. So I put the first lot, which is about half the articles, into the book Tripwire for a Tiger, which I've already mentioned.
Yes.
And now, 10 years later, the second volume, the Tigers champion,
Right.
will be coming out very
So
soon.
you found much more content, more material.
Yeah,
from,
so
from him.
I've used about half of the articles in one,
Right.
half of the articles in the other, and I
So
think the
I've,
two.
I've been reading the Tripwire
Yes.
with the tiger, and it's fascinating.
Yes.
I've gained so much of knowledge about vultures and squirrels
Yes, I
and
know. Well, my grandfather was a
sloth
very.
bears.
He was a man before his time, really.
Really?
His ideas about conservation, 100 years ago,
Right.
are utterly relevant even to this day. And he,
Tell me again, can we rewind a little
Yeah.
bit? Tell me how he came to India, and what was the first job that he went into,
Yeah, that's
and
right.
about.
well, his father was an entomologist, and he and his wife had 7 children, and there wasn't a lot of money in the family. So there wasn't enough money to send my grandfather to university. So he'd always wanted to travel to India because he'd already taken up photography of wildlife back home in Surrey in England. And his dream was to photograph a tiger, which was a species which had never been photographed in the wild before. And so he tried to find a way to come to India. And the only way that he could find at that particular time was to join the Indian police.
Right.
So he travelled out to India in 1913 and went to a police training college in Singh in East Bengal, which is now in Bangladesh and is still the police training college.
Yeah.
And so he was there for a couple of years, but he didn't like police work, and it
Mm.
didn't give him any opportunities to photograph wildlife,
Wildlife.
probably because he had very little free time. And then the First World War started, and he joined the army, and he went to serve on the northwest frontier in the Third Afghan War, which was going on at the same time as the First World War. And at the end of that, he was lucky enough to obtain a scholarship to go to Oxford University, entirely fees paid and everything. And so he then did a shortened forestry course. It was shortened because they needed to hurry up to get new forester officers
I see.
in after the First World War.
Right.
And so he came back to India again in 1922, and then he joined the forest department, and he then started to have the opportunity to go into the forests, and he.
Which was in Dehradun, was it?
Well, no, I think his first posting was in the Lansdowne Forest Division,
Right.
but he worked partly in, or sometimes in Lansdowne, sometimes here in Nainital, sometimes in what is now the Corbett National Park, but at that time was just a reserve forest. It wasn't a
Right.
protected area in particular. Also in what's now the Rajaji National Park,
Right.
and also in Dudwa.
Yes, I was
UP.
reading in the book that how he was one of the key voices
He
behind
was.
the Haley's
was, absolutely.
National Park, and which is now Jim Corbett's.
Yes, Together
national
with
park.
Jim Corbett and Sir Malcolm Haley and a number of other people,
Right.
he was on the steering committee for the founding of
Right.
what became the Haley National Park.
And
in
he also designed
1936.
the Forest Research Institute. Did he lay down the
No,
foundations?
that was his brother.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
We have several
My gosh, what a
ancestors,
family, what a
ancestors
family.
in India. His elder brother, H.G. Champion, Harry Champion, had already come to India, and he was an eminent forester who wrote a number of books which are still used by forestry students today, including a book called The Forest Types of India, which categorizes and describes all the different forest types across the whole of the Indian subcontinent, not just India now, but also Pakistan and
Wow.
Sri Lanka and Myanmar.
Right.
And so the two brothers were here at the same time.
Right.
Harry was based mostly in Dehradun, and he became director of silviculture, which is the cultivation of trees, at the FRI in Dehradun.
Okay.
Whereas my grandfather, F.W. Champion, was more of a practical sort of person, and he liked to be out in the field.
Right.
So obviously they met on numerous occasions,
Yes.
during their time here in
Yes.
India. But in 1939, Harry Champion, the elder brother, was offered the position of Professor of Forestry at Oxford University, which was a job that he could hardly say no to.
Yes.
So he then moved back to the
I
UK just before the Second World War. But FW stayed here until independence.
Tell me about your grandfather's repository of photography. I mean, and the tripwire.
Yes. Well, he was
innovation.
the sort of pioneer of that sort of photography in India. It was called tripwire photography in those days, but it was the forerunner of what is now called camera trapping. So what he would do is he would work out, by looking at pug marks, in which direction, on which path a tiger was regularly passing. And then in the daytime, he would take his very large camera, which is like this sort of size. A box, literally. And it took quarter plate glass negatives. And so he would place this big camera by the side of the path on a small tripod and cover it with leaves and branches. And then he would put a wire across the path just above the ground, and it would be connected to a magnesium flash, which he actually had to spoon the magnesium powder into, and a battery. And then he would focus the camera lens on where he thought the tiger's face would be if it came in this direction and touched the wire with its paw. But there was no guarantee that it would touch the wire. Sometimes they just stepped over it.
Even if it touched, maybe the focus was
maybe
correct.
the focus was wrong, maybe the flash wouldn't work. So it was a very hit and miss affair. But the photographs that he did get were absolutely outstanding, even though they were taken 100 years ago. And they appeared on the front covers of all sorts of magazines and journals around the world. So he became very well known as
What about yourself?
a tiger photographer.
What about your photographs?
My photographs
have they been featured in top
well,
magazines across the world?
some of them have been featured, and actually the most interesting photographs I think I've taken, which were featured in the press, were when I came to India in 2006. I retraced a journey that my grandfather, my grandmother, my father, who was only 8 years old, and my father's governess did to the Pindari Glacier in October 1936. And my father's governess wrote a diary of that journey, which they did on foot from Almora all the way to the Pindari Glacier and back. And I found this diary in the old house in Scotland because the governess gave it to my grandmother years later because she said this was the most exciting period in her life and she wanted to give it to my grandmother. So I found these diaries and they were cross-referenced with all the photographs that she and my grandfather took on that trek to the glacier. And I decided to retrace that journey exactly on precisely the same days as they did it 70 years later. Staying in the same PWD bungalows and photographing precisely the same scenes. But the most interesting photographs, which were actually published all over the world really, were the 1936 photograph of the Pindari Glacier, which shows a huge glacier in good condition with lots and lots of ice. And then I took exactly the same scene from exactly the same point in October 2006, and the ice had almost entirely receded.
Sad.
So the Indian Express and various other newspapers got hold of this, and I was interviewed a lot about that. So I think those are my most famous photographs.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And I'm sure if I went to the Pindari Glacier now,
Right.
the ice would have receded a great deal further.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me about coming back to your grandfather, because he's mapped this terrain more than you, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
Coming to Nainital,
Yes.
What was his footprint like in Nainital? What was his life in Nainital?
Well,
do you know where he stayed? And
yes, I don't know where he stayed every time because he and my grandmother didn't actually have their own house here.
Right.
They would usually rent a house, and the one that they stayed in, I think most often, was called Fairlight Glen.
And we know Fairlight.
Yes.
We crossed it in the
we
morning.
went past it in the morning.
Yes,
I saw the sign.
You didn't mention
and
it. And
I have actually been there, but now it's not like it was when they were there. I think it's been sort of upgraded or something, but it looked a bit run down when I went there in 2014 or 2015. So I don't necessarily want to go back there.
And it has a beautiful view of the Himalayas from there.
Yes, that's right, I know. So I think my grandparents came here, usually during the monsoon, because they couldn't travel through the jungles inspecting the forests, which was my grandfather's work as a forest officer. So they would come up here, perhaps in April, May, June, July, August or something like this, and they would stay in Fairlight Glen or one of these other bungalows that they rented. And they became... They didn't really like the social scene in Nainital. A lot of British people would get together at the club and do a
Right.
lot of dancing and drinking and all kinds of stuff. But my
Yes.
grandparents didn't like that.
Yes.
But they were very active members of the Boathouse Club,
Right.
or in fact the Nainital Yacht Club.
I see.
And so yesterday we
Yes.
went down to the
Yes.
Boathouse Club.
Yes.
And what's really touching is that the boats which they sailed, which were made in England in the 1890s, are still there to this day. Their favourite one, Stella,
Yes.
number 7,
Yes.
is still there in the row of yachts which are still there.
Yes.
And there are lots of memorabilia on the walls of the club and so on, including a shield
Yes.
saying FW Champion Rear Commodore 1946-47. And we have exactly the same shield, a copy, in the house in Scotland.
Right,
Yeah.
right. You showed us a couple of photographs yesterday
Mhm.
of the lake and the sailboats and the
Yes.
trophies. Tell me about the trophies. What do you have in mind about the trophies that your grandfather won in the regatta?
Yes.
Is-
Well,
back in the
in
days?
1947, he and my grandmother won a particular trophy. I can't remember the name of the cup, but it's a big and quite impressive cup. And the tradition was, of course, that whoever won it kept the cup for a year,
Right.
and then the competition was reheld the following year, and whoever won it would then receive the cup, with a little plaque at the bottom which said what year it was and who'd won it. But independence came in 1947, and they took the cup with them, and it's
Good.
still in our house in Scotland.
Wonderful.
And I would very much like to give it back to the Nainital Yacht Club
Right.
at some point in the future. But I have a feeling that very little competitive sailing is happening now.
Well, it is happening. Pre-COVID, we
Yeah.
did have a couple of regattas.
Yes.
It was an annual affair.
Yeah.
They had planned to do one last year as well.
Yeah.
But I think in the coming year we will be
Starting
having
up
one.
again.
So we'll figure it out. We'll be in touch with you.
Yes.
I'll put some people
Yes,
in
well,
touch
it would
with
be a
you.
huge
and
honour for me.
it'll
And
be a-
actually, when I came here in, I think it was 2014, but it might be 2015, and I actually presented the Governor's Gold Cup, which was quite an honour.
Oh.
Yes.
Was that for golf or?
No, for the
Oh,
yacht,
for the regatta.
It was the Governor's
Oh,
regatta.
Governor's Cup.
Yes.
Oh, wonderful.
So that was really very special.
So you have to come back again to get
Yes.
that cup.
Yes,
again.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
It's going to be a grand event for
Yes,
sure.
Yeah.
Coming back to Jim Corbett.
Mm.
Jim Corbett, as you know, in Nainital,
He's the hero.
he's the hero.
Yeah.
You walk down any lane, nook,
Yes.
corner, he's got
Yeah.
his imprint, even in the bazaar,
Yes.
a particular shop. Our neighborhood home, Mary Villas, named after his
Mm.
mother, and many homes that he owned as a property agent as well. What was the relationship between your grandfather and Jim Corbett? How were they similar yet different?
They were similar in that they both felt that wildlife was heavily under threat, and they needed something needed to be done to stop the indiscriminate destruction of wildlife, and also to protect the habitats of the wild animals. So they were very similar in that. My grandfather was more of a photographer than a shooter, and Jim Corbett actually mentions in Man-Eaters of Kumaon that he was encouraged by my grandfather to move a little away from shooting with the rifle towards shooting with the camera. So Corbett does acknowledge my grandfather as being his inspiration for doing that. My grandfather was 20 years younger than Jim Corbett, so I don't actually know how frequently they met socially. They must have met, obviously, frequently during the time when they were both serving on the steering committee for the
Right.
founding of the park.
Right.
And after independence, Jim Corbett moved to Kenya, and my grandfather and my grandmother moved to Tanzania, or Tanganyika as it was then called, and they certainly met there. But I don't know how frequently they met socially. I'm not sure at all.
Right.
But it is very interesting to see how revered Jim Corbett is in this area. And I think we should certainly acknowledge the fact that Jim Corbett was a man of the people, and he knew how to mix with the local people.
Yeah.
He was born in India, he spoke Hindi fluently,
Yes.
and he went off to France during the First World War with a team of Kumaon and Garhwal soldiers, and he lived with them. My grandfather was perhaps a little more aloof, and he hadn't been born in India, and his relationship with his staff was extremely good, but it was probably a little distant.
Sure.
Because he hadn't grown up with those people.
Right.
But I think the contribution of Jim Corbett is absolutely amazing.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Coming back to you now, when was the first time that you visited this part of
the first time that I visited
foothills
this,
of the Himalayas?
well, the first time I visited India, which included a visit to Nainital, was
Yes.
in 1988, a very long time ago.
Yes.
My father had just retired from his job in London at the age of 60, and my mother decided that it would be good for him to do something completely unrelated with his working life. So she decided to book a bird-watching holiday. My father was a passionate bird watcher, and it was with a company called Ornitholidays, which is a lovely name. Ornithology, the study of birds, and holidays.
Yes.
The company doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And so they flew out to join the tour group, and actually, coincidentally, I was working in Japan at the time, so I took time off from the school where I was working in Japan, and we met in Delhi.
Right.
We hadn't seen each other for 2 years, I think. And so we joined this tour group, and part of the tour involved coming to Nainital.
Right.
And we stayed in the Swiss hotel,
Ah.
which was very cold at that time, but we
Yes.
had a lovely time. We didn't go to the yacht club,
Right.
and it was a very packed tour program, so we didn't have time to do much of our own exploration.
Right.
But we did go to the Corbett National Park,
Right.
and we had a rather wonderful tiger sighting, which was a little scary,
Very
actually.
lucky, I must say.
Well, it was quite scary because a British birdwatching tour guide, David Hunt, had very recently been killed by a tiger because he didn't follow the instructions of the person who was accompanying his group. He was also with a group of birdwatchers.
I see.
And in those days, you could go on foot in the park, but you had to be accompanied by an armed guard. Well, David Hunt had heard an owl calling, and he wanted to photograph the owl. And he said to the group and to the forest guard who was with him, "I'm just going over that hill to try and photograph the owl, which I can hear." And the forest guard said, "No, you can't do that." But David Hunt disobeyed his instructions. He went over the hill and photographed the owl, and then a terrible scrunching sound and roaring came, and he was killed. And so when we went there, it was just after that had happened,
Right.
and we were still allowed to walk in the park. So we went off for a walk, and we didn't see a tiger, and it was okay. But then when we came back, we met a forest officer who was having tea at Dikala, and we just got chatting with him. And my father said to him, "Have you ever heard of Freddie Champion?" And this man, he said, "Oh my God, yes, he's our great hero. Would you like to come and get on an elephant, because I've been photographing a tiger all afternoon." So we got on the elephant and went to see the tiger, and there it was.
Wow.
But there were four of us, four tourists, and we were
Right.
sitting on the howdah of the
Yes.
elephant. But the guide, our guide, Simon Boys, was perched on the back, holding on like this. So we watched the tiger from the elephant and went all the way around it. But just as it was time to leave, we turned away from the tiger, and suddenly the tiger got up and roared, and the elephant swung round like this to face the tiger, and Simon nearly went off.
Down.
Yes, well, luckily he just caught, but that would have been quite a terrible thing. But when we came back to Dikala, my mother had gone off on another elephant in the afternoon because the tour group split. And she and her group had also seen a tiger, but they didn't want to confess to us that they had seen a tiger because they thought we would be jealous. And we didn't
little
want
did
to
they
tell
know.
them either. But over dinner, when we had a couple of beers, it came out that both groups had seen a tiger.
So
that
you were
was
even.
quite something.
You were
we were
even.
even. So that was my first visit. Then I came again in 2006
Right.
to do the trek to the Pindari Glacier and to
Right.
visit a lot of other places associated with my family. And my parents came to join me, and
Sure.
we went down to the
Oh,
yacht club.
what a
and so
memory.
on.
I
That
saw
was
those
lovely.
photographs,
You saw those
yes.
photographs.
Yes.
And then I came again in 2014 and 2015, each time for several months, with a very old lady called Rosemary Fox, who had been born in Lansdowne, the same place as my father was born, but 2 years after him. And her parents were my grandparents' best friends.
Oh,
And they actually
wonderful.
hoped that the two children would marry in the future, almost like an arranged marriage, but they didn't.
Yeah.
But anyway, I came with her, and we travelled around all the places that she remembered from her childhood, including to the Birla Vidya Mandal school, where she went to school during the Second World War.
I see.
So that was very emotional for her.
Oh, goodness.
And we went into the dining hall where she remembered being punished by her elder sister. And the punishment was to stand on the bench during lunch.
I see.
While all the other children were
Ate
eating.
food.
And so we had to get her up onto the bench so that she could stand there for a photo. About
lovely memory.
70 years after she'd
Lovely
been there
memory.
as a schoolgirl.
Yes.
So that was quite special.
So now I hear that you're going to be making frequent visits.
Yes.
What about?
Well, actually, I'm hoping to run tours in the footsteps of my grandfather and to other parts of India, perhaps even ones that he didn't visit. But as I have been coming to India for a very long time, I'm pretty well versed in the birds of India and also of butterflies. And so it's a very nice opportunity for me to work as a birdwatching and wildlife tour guide in the area where my grandfather used to be based, and to share those experiences with other people. And I'm actually here now with a group of 6,
Right.
and this is a kind of trial run, and it seems to be going very well.
Yes, I think
And
so.
so from next winter, I'm hoping to be running more tours to India, certainly on an annual basis.
Look forward to
Yes.
those. I hope I can be a part of those.
I
One of
certainly hope
those
you
again.
can, and
Though I'm having a wonderful time right now with this group that you've got, and we've spotted some great birds
We did spot
this
some very nice
morning.
birds this morning.
So
Yeah.
it's been a wonderful experience, and your eye for spotting the birds, your knowledge, impeccable, of course, and it comes with experience over
Yeah,
the
it
years.
does. Yes, because
And
I
great
have been
passion
doing
that
it
you
for a very
have.
long time.
Yes.
Yeah.
So wonderful, James. Thank you for this wonderful conversation, and all the best for your future tours that you'll be bringing to India, and hope to see more of you again at Abbotsford.
Yes, and I'd just like to say how much the guests are enjoying our stay at Abbotsford. You've made us feel extremely welcome, and the building is absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you.
We're really having a wonderful time, and we'll certainly use this hotel in the future.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.